I'm Dr. Robyn Boere, and I'm a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in Christian ethics. And so I study all sorts of things about the moral life and what is right and wrong. And especially, I look at questions of medical ethics and environmental ethics. And this allows me to use some of my background as well. I have a PhD in theological ethics, but I have an undergraduate degree in biochemistry. So I actually started out in the sciences. And while I'm not at all an expert on immunology or vaccines, working in medical ethics really allows me to bring together those two interests.
Amazing. And so tell me, because obviously this is a really sticky ethical conversation that we're having. So can you sort of talk to me about that and how it is to be doing your job in these times, I guess?
That's a great question. I mean, this is a sticky ethical question. The thing, though, of course, is what you have to realize is ethicists are a bit weird. When we encounter sticky ethical problems, we get really excited about them. And the reason I get excited about them is not just because, oh, it's fun to think through a problem, but because it's a really good thing when people have ethical qualms. It's really good that people are thinking seriously about what it means to take a vaccine and how a vaccine was developed and how this contributes to their own life and the lives of others. These are great things because what it means is that people are really thinking about what it means to live a good life and what it means to do the right thing, what it means to be a good person and to act according to what one believes. And so I think of this not as a set of problems that we just need to overcome and find the best way to sweep under the rug, but these are questions to be addressed seriously. But at the same time, when you have a sticky ethical problem like this, it can feel really paralyzing, right? You have this thing that you know is bad, and then you have another thing that you think is bad, and then some things that might be good, and it feels like there's no way through, right? And then we sometimes make the mistake of simplifying it and just saying, okay, there's this bad thing, and then there's this neutral thing. So if taking the vaccine is bad, then I can't do it. And we don't really think about the fact that there's goods and bads about taking it in both directions. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, about how do we navigate a complex problem like this, where there's not a clear neutral or one clear good or one clear bad that aren't in competition, but how we actually think through. And what I hope to do today is to help people think through these questions for themselves.
Amazing. Yes, please. I mean, how can we do that? Talk to me about how we do that.
And so how we do that and how we do it in Christian ethics is to use a bunch of well, I like to call them tools of the trade, ethical tools and concepts and ideas that help us not exactly draw lines, but help us differentiate between different types of things. So there are tools so for example, if you came up to me and you said, I'm going to rob a bank, would you like to be my getaway driver? And I go, yes, actually, you know what? I like to be in the bank too. And I'd like 30% of the cut. I am so into bank robbing. That's very different. We'd think about my involvement very differently than if I was in my car just outside of a bank and you jumped in and you put a gun to my head and you said, you're my getaway driver now, drive. And we actually, there are ways in ethics where we think about those differences, thinking about what cooperation looks like. That's one word that we use. And we have these tools that allow us to think through and differentiate those different categories.
And we talked before about the vaccine, and obviously some people can see that as a really bad thing, but it's sort of relative in that cooperation point of view. So in terms of the vaccine or taking the vaccine, for people who might be worried about that, but for all kinds of reasons, why sort of explain to me how that is measurable.
There are particular ethical qualms with the vaccines, and especially today I'm going to talk about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, although a lot of what I have to say is true as well for the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine or Johnson & Johnson and so on. Some of them will be a little bit different. The Chinese vaccine that was developed, I believe it introduced a new cell line, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so that actually makes it a little bit, it adds a new dimension of ethical consideration that's not there for the Pfizer vaccine or for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which use older cell lines. And I'll explain what that means. So all this to say, I'm going to really talk about the AstraZeneca vaccine today, and I'm really going to talk about two sort of moral concerns that people have. And one of those has to do with concerns about the use of fetal cells in the vaccine, and especially for Christians who are pro-life, and even for Christians who are not. So there are a variety, Christians take a variety of positions on abortion, but many Christians are pro-life, and many Christians are also, they might be okay with abortion in particular circumstances. So in the circumstances of child pregnancy or rape or incest, those often go together, unfortunately. And you know, in medical emergencies and whatever. So some Christians are very adamantly against all forms of abortion, but a lot of Christians take a position that's a bit more nuanced, but still very concerned about the use of fetal cells that from abortion in medical research. And actually, a lot of Christians are worried about the use of human cells in research more generally, and questions about what we do with our body and those sorts of things. So that would be kind of one concern that people have, and we'll talk about that. And then I'll also talk a little bit about animal research, because I think a lot of people look at the virus and they read on the news that it was made from a chimpanzee adenovirus vector and then in a modified human embryonic kidney. And it can feel like a lot of information, and you don't know what's going on, and it gets tested on monkeys. And so I'm going to talk about the two big, I think, ethical qualms that Christians have are about fetal cells and also about animal research. So this is a long way of answering your question. And one of the reasons it's a long way of answering your question is there are no generic rules for how you evaluate cooperation with something that's bad, or how do you kind of weigh the bads with the goods. That always has to be specific. And I don't just say this so that we keep ethicists in jobs, but that the questions that we're asking are actually really specific to it. So I'm going to start and just talk about abortion and cell lines and how I work through this myself. So when the vaccine was developed, they used an Immortal cell line called HEK293. And those cells came from a fetus from 1973 that is commonly believed to have been obtained from elective abortion. Interestingly, there's a colleague of mine in the United States named Nicanor Austriaco, and he actually reached out to Dr. Graham Ward, who developed this cell, who was involved in developing the cell line, to ask him where these cells came from. And the answer is actually that no one knows. It could have been from a miscarriage, and it could have been from a voluntary abortion, and we don't actually know that. But for this discussion, let's take it as a fact that, you know, we could work on the assumption, well, how would we work this through if they were from an abortion? And then also there's a concern about these immortal cell lines. So what happens is scientists will harvest some cells, in this case from a fetus, and then they'll reproduce those cells in a lab. And they can do this on and on and on. And that's why they're called immortal cell lines, because these cells were harvested from a fetus in 1973, but we're still using them today in 2021. And they end up being really useful because scientists know a lot about them. And if you did science, in high school, or one thing you'll remember is you always have to set up the control group, right? That that group that what's going to happen. And so this isn't quite the same, but you want to control as many variables as you can, and using a cell line that already exists allows scientists to do that. But these are still ethically problematic because it's someone's cells, parts of their body, that are continuing to live in labs for all time, right? And so we can ask ourselves, well, what is and isn't our body? Because we are our bodies and we are our cells. But at the same time, we shed cells all the time. We shed skin cells and cells from our organs, and we shed hairs all over the place, and especially in the shower drain. And so there are all these things, and it can be tricky. And so in some way, it's very true to say that the fetus, whether aborted or not, that fetus is long gone, and so are the original fetal cells, and that there's no fetal body or fetal tissue left. But at the same time, it's not quite so simple, and especially some cells, immortal cell lines, were taken from people without their permission. And this is especially the case. There's a famous cell line in the United States that was harvested in the 1950s from an African-American woman without her knowledge or her permission. And now there's these cells that were part of her that live on in laboratories forever. So I think we can say that even aside from concerns about abortion, there are some concerns, moral concerns, about having immortal cell lines. But one thing that an immortal cell line does, and this is ethically important for us here, is it distances the participation or the cooperation in the act of abortion. So even if HEK 293 came from an aborted fetus, in many ways that fetus doesn't exist anymore. And we have this cell line. And so when people say that, when people hear that there's fetal tissue in the development, I think they're often thinking that this requires ongoing abortions to make this happen. And in this case, that's not true. One of the other things I'll say about this cell line is that they are already used extensively in research and in the development of treatments and drugs. Now, normally we don't hear anything about it. It doesn't make the news because it's not something like the COVID vaccines that everyone's paying attention to. But what it means is that as a society, we're quite reliant on these cells. The chances that many of us take medications or have used treatments that involved these cell lines is actually quite high. And this is part of what it means to live in a morally complex world, that we benefit a lot from past and present actions that we might think are wrong. And the reality is that many of us participate in this all the time, not just in medicine, but through unjust structures, through pollution, exploitative economic systems, that the things that make our life kind of go are complicit in these morally complex systems. And so what do we do with that? Well, in the case of the fetal cells that are involved in developing the vaccine, there are two questions I think that are really important. And one of them relates to that bank robbery example, and that's, to what extent are we participating in the act that we think that is wrong? And the second question is, will doing this perpetuate or require more future wrong acts? So, if we believe that abortion is wrong, then the first question is, are we participating in the abortion? And to go back to that bank robber example, there's a difference between willingly participating and wanting it to happen and an unwilling participation. And so in the case of a willing participation, that's clearly going to be a problem. If you think abortion is wrong, and this involves wanting an abortion to have happened and wanting it to happen again, then for many Christians, that would be a really big problem. But I don't think that's the case here. I think we can really regret the fact that an abortion happened. And especially in the case of these cells, we don't know for sure that they did come from a voluntary abortion. So even if, as a Christian, you're against voluntary abortion, there's a distance there too. There's not the certainty that it happened here. And because of the immortal cell line, there's not the desire that it happens again, right? You can actually continue to use these cell lines without requiring future abortions. And so by taking the vaccine, then I think one can say, well, we're not participating. We don't want the thing that's bad to happen. And in many ways, and so this is called material cooperation instead of formal. So it means we don't will that it happens. And then when it comes to material cooperation, so that the fact that we didn't will it happen, we talk about near and far, or and that's really how involved are you in making it happen, right? So maybe I don't want to rob a bank, but I'm perfectly happy to give you a lift and just not ask you any questions. Well, I'm still quite involved, right? But if it's the case that I knew you were thinking of robbing a bank, and but I didn't really have anything to do about it, but I happened to drive by at the time, and maybe you got in my car. I'm involved, but even a little bit, maybe less. And it's hard, here's where the analogy breaks down a little bit with the vaccine. But in this case, then our participation now in an abortion that may or may not have happened in 1973 is extremely remote. We're very far away from the act. And actually, for people like me, that act occurred before we were even born. And while there are moral concerns that I have about immortal cell lines, first, I think that for many Christians, while there are moral qualms about it, it's not seen as what we call an intrinsically evil, act in and of itself. So what I mean by that is that while it's ethically problematic, it's less certain that it's a wrong for many people and that it's always going to be a wrong. And so, like I said, when I think of it as part of living in this morally complex world where I benefit from these actions that I may think are wrong. And this happens when I get into my car. This happens when I have investments in banks that I know engage in predatory loan practices. I don't want those to happen. But part of living in a morally complex world is the fact that we can't always avoid some involvement in actions that are wrong. And so we have to think about, well, do we want them to happen? And then also, are there other options? And so that's the last thing to consider with the vaccines is there a vaccine that's developed that doesn't use an immortal cell line that may come from an aborted fetus? And the answer is that there isn't. Okay, so when we're evaluating this, we're not thinking about something like using a shampoo. Should I use a bar shampoo instead of a bottle shampoo because it's better for the earth? Well, or a shampoo, when I talk about animal research, like a shampoo that was involved, they tested on animals. Well, there's so many options where they didn't. That's great. With the vaccines, there isn't that option. So now we've talked about, are we participating in this action that is morally wrong? Do we want it to happen? Are we are we close to the action, or and then are there options where it doesn't involve? So that's not the case. But still, there's something that is, it's not like we've erased the fact that there is moral complexity about this. And so what's important then is to consider, well, what's the alternative? And I think a lot of people think about not taking the vaccine as a moral neutral. And that's just not true. Because refusing the vaccine is also a moral act that is seen in the context of what ethicists often call the common good. That when we refuse the vaccine, we're not just refusing protection for ourselves, which a lot of people will argue is a personal issue, right? But we're also refusing protection for people around us. So first, I think, as you'll note, no vaccine actually gives 100% protection. And some people can't take a vaccine for various medical reasons. And how do we protect those people? Well, we do it through what scientists call herd immunity. That it takes, and if you remember the beginning of the pandemic especially, there was a lot of talk about transmission chains and how if we stay at home, we can help break those transmission chains. Well, that's exactly what a vaccine does. A vaccine doesn't offer any individual 100% protection, and you can't vaccinate 100% of your population. But if you have a sufficient number of people vaccinated, you cut enough transmission chains that the disease can't go anywhere. And when you do this actually really aggressively, like we did with smallpox, you can actually eradicate a disease. And so a disease that used to kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, no longer exists in human populations. And that's because through herd immunity, the disease actually ended up dying out. Some diseases, like the flu, are rapidly mutating, and so they don't actually die out in our population, but their effects are really mitigated by a vaccine. But either way, the vaccine is involved in protecting people. It's not the case at all that we're concerned about being involved in a bad action and then the other action is kind of just good or neutral, but actually, it's about the choice between taking the vaccine, a possible evil, and not taking the vaccine. And so many ethicists, and medical ethicists especially, talk about the vaccine as a moral good. And why? Because it contributes to that protection of oneself, of our families, of our communities, and our country from illness and potentially from death. And those are good things, right? I mean, this is why, as a society, we have medical care and either insurance schemes or public medicine that we think of, and because we are our bodies, taking care of our bodies and taking care of the bodies of the people around us, those are moral goods. And so we often talk about this as the common good or as love of neighbor, that taking the vaccine is actually a way of caring for others. And I especially think about this for when people talk about being pro-life. They often forget that pro-life is not just about abortions. It's rooted in a recognition of the value and dignity of every human being. And so we have to think about the vaccine. Does the vaccine contribute to the value and dignity? Does it acknowledge the value and dignity? Does it contribute to the good of humans? And as a medical ethicist, I say, yes, that's exactly the case. That we're protecting others and that's in line with, that protecting people from death is fully in line with being pro-life.
What are the ethical questions that people might have around animal testing or animals being involved in the vaccine, and is that something we should be taking into consideration?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think there are two things that come up, and the first is that the vaccine used a chimpanzee adenovirus-based vector as a carrier for the SARS-CoV-2. And I think one of the things that people can really think about is, first, like, did they kill a bunch of chimps to make this happen? And secondly, real concerns about mixing animal parts with humans, right? and especially that's getting injected into your body. I mean, a lot of people eat meat, and we tend not to be concerned about those animal parts becoming part of us. Even though, of course, animal protein breaks down and becomes part of our protein. That's kind of, one of the main nutritional reasons to eat meat. But you're having this thing injected into you. And so the first thing I think that's really important to clarify is that the vector is an adenovirus that chimpanzees get. And adenovirus, there's human ones too. We get them all the time. They cause what we think of as the common cold. The common cold is actually caused by a few different viruses. We describe it by the symptoms, not by what causes it. But so they're human adenoviruses. You and I have probably had them. But this one's similar, but it's from a chimpanzee. And so it's not actually part of a chimpanzee at all. It's a virus that they get. And it's harvested actually from their poo. Because when we have viruses, or when animals have viruses, they shed them in their fecal matter. And so what scientists do is they can isolate this virus, and then they modify it so it no longer replicates in cells, which means that human beings can't catch the chimpanzee virus. And so why do they use it? Well, it's just a little bit more effective at penetrating our cells, because since we've all had a bunch of human adenoviruses, we tend to have some amount of immunity to them. And so by using a chimpanzee one, they can get around. So, and this is why understanding the situation is so important for our moral evaluation, that you can get really morally concerned about having animal parts injected into ourselves. But in this case, that's just not the case. And no chimpanzees were harmed, right? This it's just a bunch of poo collection. But there are animal research concerns involved with the virus, and that's that the vaccine was tested in rhesus macaque monkeys. And so this raises a moral issue for Christians, that of the use of non-human animals in experimentations. And there's a long history of that, and its chief sins, as my colleague David Clough would say, come from insufficient and poorly enforced regulation, and also often the inconsistency of our arguments for animal testing and experimentation, and the fact that a lot of animal testing doesn't actually predict human results. And so those are all concerns. And for Christians, of course, there's a recognition that God created the world, and God loves the world. And, in the Genesis narrative, when God created the world, he saw that it was good. And so for many Christians, taking care of and loving the world, including animals, is really important. And so the involvement of animals in research should always cause us pause, in the same way that human cells and human tissues in research should at least cause us to stop and really morally evaluate. And what we can do here is use the same type of reasoning that we used about abortion with animal research. And the first one is to ask, were these monkeys harmed? Animal research, I think, again, if it's done properly and well, generally isn't regarded as an intrinsic evil. And so that it's always bad no matter what. But often it depends on the circumstances. So in this case, we can look at, were these monkeys harmed? And the answer is no. None of them got sick and died. And was it poorly enforced and those sorts of things? Well, in this case, no. It does happen in a lot of animal experimentation, but in this case, I think they treated the animals quite well. And I think that fact helps us deal with the fact that we're much more involved when we think about that cooperation in terms of proximity, how close we are to the act. In this case, they actively tested this vaccine on animals, so we're a lot closer to the act. But I think this particular act, when it's done well and safely and with care for the animals, that mitigates some of our moral concerns about animal experimentation. And again, we can think about options. So where there are other options, I think it's safe to say we ought to, for moral reasons, especially for Christians for moral reasons, avoid products that use animal research. But in this case, they're, unlike the shampoos, there aren't alternatives that aren't tested. And so then we have to do the same thing that we did again with concerns about abortion and immortal cell lines, and that's weigh it against the good of human communities and the good of your neighbor and that protection of your own health and the health of others and working to prevent deaths. And one of the other things I should say about that, which I didn't earlier, is that it's not only about deaths, but it's also about all of the sources of suffering that came about because of the pandemic, right? So the economic toll that this took on people, the deep social toll that it took on people, the loneliness, all of those are also important, not, and we should care about. So it's not just, I share my own skepticisms about, firing up the economy again. But I think there are lots of goods of human life and human flourishing that we've missed out on in the pandemic. We've discovered new ones, I think, for a lot of us. Most of us aren't so used to spending this much time around our spouses or children. And that comes with goods and bads. But all this to say, it's not just about death and protecting people's bodies, but it's about human well-being in general, that this and the societal needs that we have. So when we weigh the moral ills of animal research in this case against the good of the vaccine, I think we can say that there's a proportional enough reason for that good, even with these qualms. And I should say, of course, that none of the vaccines contain ingredients that come from animals. There are two important differences between vaccines which are tested on animals and, say, shampoos that are tested on animals. And one of those I think I hinted at is that there are lots of shampoos out there that aren't. But secondly, and this comes to the proportion question, that skipping your shampooing doesn't put other people at risk of a potentially fatal disease. It can be really unpleasant when you sit beside them on the bus, but they'll survive. So when it comes to evaluating whether or not, as a Christian, one can morally take the vaccine, we have to consider the moral wrongs that are being done and our involvement in them. And in other segments, I've kind of drawn out in a much longer fashion how to do that. But we have to weigh qualms about fetal cells and immortal cell lines and animal research against the proportional good of taking a vaccine. That is, that it's not about what is wrong versus what is neutral, but what is wrong against what is right or what is good, and that there is specifically goods of taking the vaccine and wrongs involved, so that actually by refusing the vaccine is also morally fraught and morally problematic. And why is this the case? Because taking the vaccine is not just about protection for yourself. One of the analogies I quite enjoy is a whole bunch of people on a boat in their individual cabins. And someone chops a hole in the floor of their cabin and says, well, I don't see what other people are complaining about. It's my cabin. I can do what I want. But it's not just about his or her cabin, say it's me who chopped the floor. It's not just about my cabin filling up with water. But unless that's a completely enclosed cabin, it will sink the entire boat. And I'm not saying that an individual's refusal of the vaccine is going to, sink the entire ship, as it were. But it's that you can't think about these things just in terms of your own personal protection. So the vaccine isn't just about you. The vaccine is actually not about protection of yourself, but it's protection of your neighbor, protection of your whole community, protection of the people you may not even know and think about. It's protecting a whole bunch of vulnerable people in a care home by having the entire chain of people who are involved in getting food or clean bedding or whatever to them all protected, so that they don't bring diseases to people where it will probably kill them. And because vaccines don't give any individual 100% protection, And because you can't vaccinate 100% of your population, because there are always people for whom, for medical reasons, they can't receive a vaccine, that you have to think about vaccines in the larger picture. And at the beginning of the pandemic, if you remember, there were all sorts of diagrams about chains of transmission and cutting chains of transmission and how that can stop it from growing. And that's exactly what vaccine protection does. And so if you can imagine Ethel's a good, vulnerable person name, I think. Except, I don't know, maybe people are naming their toddlers Ethel again. All right, this is old Ethel, okay? But here we have Ethel. She's vulnerable for some reason. Maybe she's elderly, maybe she has underlying medical conditions. And you kind of have people milling around Ethel, and they all come into contact, but if they can't transmit the disease to Ethel, if all these people who are kind of come into direct contact with her, then even though Ethel's unvaccinated, she's protected from the disease. And as a matter of fact, if you want to read about this in scientific terms, it's called herd immunity. And what it is, it's a way of stopping diseases from circulating in a population. And as I think became clear from the lockdowns and mask wearing and social distancing, is that our own choices by themselves, each individual choice, isn't enough. It has to be collective action. And in moral terms, we talk about this regard for the community or for just other people in general as the common good. And often for Christians, we talk about this in terms of love of neighbor. And if you remember from the parables that Jesus talked about, our neighbors aren't just the people who we like or who we see as being part of our community. Because we might think to ourselves, well, you know what, all of my friends, like we're all young and we're all healthy, we're all hip. No, I'm joking. But you might think to yourself, well, everyone I know is healthy and young, and so it's not really a risk. But the reality is we don't live in closed little bubbles. We live in communities. And so because taking care of our own bodies is a moral good, and because taking care of other people's bodies and also their general well-being is a moral good, then taking the vaccine is a moral good that has to be weighed against the moral wrongs involved in vaccine production. So one of the concerns that has come up about the vaccines, and especially in some Christian communities, is concern that the vaccine is what is called the mark of the beast. And what is the mark of the beast? Well, it comes from Revelation, chapter 13. And in that passage, John is talking about the beast, whose number is 666, and a mark that is required for people to buy and sell and those sorts of things. And so one concern about, for some Christians, is whether the vaccine is this mark of the beast that is talked about, and especially because with talk of vaccine passports, and in places like Israel, who have vaccinated a large portion of their population, access to gyms and theaters and stuff were restricted to people who are vaccinated. There's a lot of concern about this. And it's tempting for people to just say, well, this is just about the Bible and it's not a moral concern, but it's definitely a moral concern because it's a concern of people who are trying to live according to what, is good and according to faithfulness to God in a complex time. And there can be a lot to say about the particular ways of reading the Bible. There's a fellow named Curtis Chang who runs BioLogos, which is a website. He's from the United States, and he addresses this question about how we read the Bible and those sorts of things, which can be really helpful. But what I want to say about it is this, and that is that this isn't the first time that there have been concerns about particular things that the government does as the mark of the beast. And there are actually many things in life that limit our participation in buying and selling. And this concern comes up again and again. So it was raised with the introduction of Social Security numbers in the United States in the 60s and 70s, because of course you needed a Social Security number to do anything, to get a job, to have a bank account. And then in the 1980s with credit cards, and then in the 2000s with RFID chips. And in each of these cases, the mark of the beast was associated with something new that we were afraid of or suspicious of. And as those things became as we became comfortable with those things, and as they became normal in society, and especially as no other signs of the end times followed them, the concerns about particular pieces of technology being the mark of the beast fell away. When the world kept turning and the end times didn't come, then those concerns subsided. And the vaccine, I think, fits really well into this. It's new and it is scary. There is a lot that we don't know about it. And I think as millions and millions and millions of people are vaccinated, some side effects are coming to light, and those sorts of things. And that can be really concerning. Of course, other vaccines also have side effects that occur in 1 to 2 million people. So with the flu vaccine, I think there's a 1 in 1 million or 1 in 2 million chance that you develop a condition called Guillain-Barré. And so this happens a lot, but it can be really scary. And I think with something like a vaccine that's new, and we look for ways to control our fears and to deal with our fears. And actually, I think this speaks to some of the other moral concerns as well. I think there's a temptation sometimes to exaggerate our moral concerns. So exaggerate the amount of participation with abortion or animal research or something that we consider wrong, so that we don't have to then take a vaccine and face those fears. And I think that that's a really, and I don't say this to dismiss concerns, but I think one of the soul-searching things each one of us has to do, because ethics is a lot about soul-searching, is ask ourselves, are these legitimate moral qualms? Do I have these about everything that involves immortal cell lines? Or do I actually just have it about the vaccine because I'm scared to take it? And I think that that's something really important for us to keep in mind. While I'm on this topic, actually, I'll continue my excursus, which is to say, one of the other morally problematic behaviors that I see a lot around moral concerns or moral qualms with the vaccine is an completely uncharitable and inappropriate vilifying of people who express doubts about the vaccine, or people who bring up some of the morally problematic issues. Now, of course, if you're pro-life and the people around you aren't pro-life, you don't share the same moral concerns about the vaccine. And for some people, animal research isn't going to be a problem. But for people who are very strongly against that, and who are vegan, are very concerned about, are there any animal products? Was this tested on animals? And that sort of thing. But in either of those cases, what I see a lot is a vilifying of these people, as if to say, like, they're so, they're either stupid or even evil or pernicious for bringing up things that are morally wrong. But like I said earlier, the reality is we live in a morally complex world where there are a lot of things that are wrong that go on. And one of the tricky things, as a Christian, or as a member of another religion, or as a member of no religion, everyone has moral desires and things that they think are right and wrong. And one of the challenges we have is working through these. And so one of the other things that I think is actually needs to be morally questioned is this automatic then vilifying people who either have doubts, safety doubts and concerns, or people who have moral qualms about the vaccines. And one of the things that's most important for everyone is to work through these questions charitably and with compassion, but also with honesty. So that if there are, 1,000 safety studies that say yes, and one from that your aunt posted on Facebook with no citations that says no, you can't weigh those the same. But that actually, that I think what's really morally important is for everyone to work through this and to be honest about the problems as well as the benefits, to be honest about the bads as well as the goods. Yeah, so one of the really tricky things as well, I think, especially for Christians, and especially I think for younger Christians, and not just Christians, but younger people in general. I've been talking a lot about Christian ethics because that's, I think, the audience, and also because that's what I do. But I think one of the concerns for a lot of younger people with no underlying conditions is it feels somehow wrong to be getting a vaccine when all sorts of vulnerable populations in other countries don't have one. And this is one more piece of living in a morally complex world that has structural injustices, and that our own attempts to live faithful and moral lives happen in the midst of this complexity. And so one of the questions I really ask myself is, if I didn't get it, would those other countries be getting it? And I think the answer right now, at least in the UK, is no. The UK is not giving up its national supply, but it wants that for the good of its population. That, and again, because vaccines don't offer 100% protection, whatever, so that younger people being vaccinated is actually really important for communal well-being. And so again, it's not just about our personal, do I need this protection? But for the UK to kind of say, well, we need young people to be vaccinated for the good of the whole country, for the good of the whole community. At the same time, I think when we live, especially in wealthy and privileged countries, one of the questions that needs to be considered, and it can only be considered on a national or communal level, is when do we as a community decide to give up certain benefits for others? So the UK could give a whole bunch of vaccines to other countries and massively slow down its campaign, but what would that require? It would require ongoing social distancing, probably some waves of lockdowns, and those sorts of things to make it work. And so in some ways, it's not something that we can at all, like many of these things, do individually at all. And so for myself, when I think about it, I think about two things. First, receiving my vaccine when it gets offered, because I'm working within a system that is way larger than me and that I don't have control over. But when it comes to voting or the letters that I write to my member of parliament, now of course I can't vote in the UK, so in some ways for me, I have very little ability to change what's going on. But the type of change that would have to happen would have to be at a country level, and so it's totally okay to take your vaccine when it's offered, but continue to press the government and to campaign for vaccine justice around the world. Those are morally consistent things to do, and so it's not an either or. But if you're a younger UK citizen and this is something that you're really concerned about, then you should be pushing, your parliament and those sorts of things. But you have to recognize that refusing the vaccine doesn't actually help that happen. You have to think about the types of actions that will, and recognize that it's the type of decision that can really only be made on a large-scale communal level, because it requires the whole community to give something up. Not just you giving up your chance for a vaccine, but actually it requires the entire country, the entire group, countries, to give up privileges of being able to reopen and all those sorts of things. And that kind of action has to be taken communally. And so you can push for that kind of action, absolutely, while still receiving your vaccine when it's your turn, because recognizing that that's the best choice you can make in a morally complex situation. Going back to Mark the Beast, a lot of how we deal with these concerns comes down to how the book of Revelation is read. And if people want really detailed information on this, the best place to go is to a biblical scholar. But as someone who, of course, still studies the Bible for my work, I'll talk a little bit about it. And that is that the book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature. It's a particular style of writing, and it's not meant to be a detailed commentary on our lives today, which is not at all to say that it's not relevant, but it's about asking ourselves what type of relevance it has. Did the writer of Revelation, inspired by God, mean to tell each of us basically what exactly is going to happen politically here and now in the end times? Or was the author talking about what was actually going on for the church at that time, and also prophesying what the future of the world and what God's promises are? And I think what's most likely is that God did not mean any identifying factor in our civic life to be the mark of the beast. I think it's talking about spiritual realities. And John, who wrote it, when he wrote about it, he talks about these spiritual realities in metaphorical language. And he also uses metaphorical language to talk about the situation of Christians in the first century. So if we're going to map particular people or particular characters or particular institutions, we need to think about those at the time that was being written. And so a lot of biblical scholars will talk about the kind of number system that was used. It's not exactly cryptology, but kind of the number coding system that was used. And I think there's quite a good argument that the number 666 translates to Nero, who was a Roman emperor. And so I don't think that the book of Revelation doesn't have anything allegorical to what's going on in the world. But I do think that it's not about the particular institutions of the world today. And the other thing is, so when reading the book of Revelation, I don't think we can easily map the government as the beast and then anything that the government encourages people to get as a mark of the beast. And one of the reasons for this is other biblical passages. So I look at Peter's words in his letter about government, right? Where he's, Christians should live in the land faithfully, should respect their governments until it essentially. So governments, for Peter, governments aren't good. They certainly don't take the place of God, but they're also not evils that have to be resisted the way that we resist Satan and his works, and the way that we resist things that we know are evil. So I don't mean this to say the book of Revelation isn't important for how we think about our lives as Christians. I think it's actually the opposite. The book of Revelation tells us what is ultimately true in the world, right? That God is in control, that the world isn't as it should be, but that there's hope in the gospel and a promise of a new heaven and a new earth. And most importantly, I think the entire biblical story assures us that in the face of uncertainties, in the face of things that we fear, in the face of things we don't understand, that God is with us. And that's also not to say that I don't think there isn't proper caution about government control, especially morally. One of the things that often comes up in questions of medical research is the ways in which governments have engaged in incredibly evil acts of medical experimentation on people of color, and on people with disabilities. And that happened a lot in the development of medication, in understanding the progression of disease. So the Tuskegee syphilis trial in the United States is a particularly egregious example. In Eastern Canada, there's a reported case of vaccine trials being done on children with disabilities who were in like a care home, and so they actually injected children with disabilities with, I believe it was hepatitis. And so there's all of these, so that there's a long history of people receiving either inferior medical treatment or especially being victims of medical experimentation and government-sponsored medical experimentation. And one of the things I think that's also really important, and not that I can tell the government what it ought to do morally, but that the government should be open and transparent about those injustices. And that did happen in the United States. In 1997, Bill Clinton publicly acknowledged the syphilis trials, or the syphilis. We could call it a study. It's not a study. It was, massively immoral medical experimentation. But he acknowledged that, and one of the key developers in the Pfizer vaccine actually is an African American woman, and I think that one of the steps that has been taken is governments being open and transparent, and also I know at least in the United States that the government and the drug companies made a real point of properly and ethically involving African Americans in the vaccine trials. And like I said, that there are African American scientists involved in the development of these vaccines. I think that's a huge step forward, but it's not enough. And one of the things governments need to do is be open and transparent about their past actions and provide not only, verbal assurances, but as much proof as they can that it's not continuing today. So in Christian ethics, we sometimes talk about this as God's preferential option for the poor. So the fact that God is especially in solidarity with those who are oppressed. And as Christians, we need to do the same. And so when it comes to vaccine justice, like who's getting it, or when it comes to the really unjust treatment of particular groups of people, this is something that Christians ought to fight against and push their governments to fight against. And this goes along with concern for the common good, that communities can only flourish when there is justice in the entire community and when we care for the entire community. And so one thing I think churches and the government should really keep in mind is the experiences and needs of minority ethnic and also communities with disabilities, and really take those things, their concerns seriously. And that's absolutely part of neighbor love.